Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to deconstruct a major new law, one that was forged in the wake of a terrible tragedy. It's designed to fight hate in Australia, and it's called the Combatting Antisemitism, Hate and Extremism Bill 2026.
So, how did we even get here? Well, it all happened incredibly fast. On December 14th, 2025, there was a shocking anti-Semitic terror attack at Bondi Beach. The political reaction was, to put it mildly, swift. Within a week, the Prime Minister announced new laws were on the way. By early January, a draft bill was out, and the public was given just 1 week to make submissions. Then, Parliament was called back from its break to debate it. This is, without a doubt, one of the fastest legislative responses we've seen in recent memory.
All right, so to really get our heads around this thing, what it does and why it's so controversial, we're going to tackle it in 5 parts. First, we'll look at the tragedy that sparked the law. Then we'll break down the government's 3-part plan. From there, we'll dive into the really contentious stuff, policing speech and tackling extremist tools. And finally, we'll ask the big question. What are the risks of a law that was made in such a hurry?
Okay, let's dive right in. The government's goal here was pretty clear. They wanted to show a swift, powerful response to violence. This was all about taking decisive action when faced with extremist hate.
And if you look at the government's own summary, you can see their intention laid out. This is not a single-issue bill. They're trying to hit this problem from multiple angles. First, crack down on the hateful conduct itself. Second, control who can even enter the country to spread hate. And third, reduce the number of weapons floating around in the community. It's a multi-front approach for sure. So, the big question is, how exactly does the bill plan to do all of this? Well, it's really built on 3 main pillars. It moves from policing ideas and speech to controlling the borders, and finally, to dealing with the physical tools of violence.
And what's really interesting here is how you can see that strategy broken down. Step 1 is all about new government powers over what people can say and what groups they can join. Step 2 is about stricter border control, specifically to keep out so-called hate preachers. And Step 3 is a national crackdown on guns.
Okay, this brings us to what is, without a doubt, the most talked about part of this bill. This is where it steps directly into the very tricky area of policing ideas and public expression. Now, here's the absolute crucial point you need to understand. This new crime, it doesn't require any call to violence. The legal test is whether someone's conduct is intended to incite hatred and whether it would cause a reasonable person from that targeted group to feel intimidated or fear for their safety.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. The old legal standard for these kinds of crimes was really focused on incitement to imminent violence, a direct threat. This new standard shifts the focus to the emotional impact of speech, whether a reasonable person would feel intimidated. That's a fundamental move from policing actions to, in a way, policing feelings.
And we're not talking about a slap on the wrist here. The penalties are severe, a maximum of 5 years in prison. And get this, that doesn't just apply to the new public hate speech offense. It also cranks up the penalty for using a service, like social media, to simply cause offense.
So as you can imagine, this has raised a whole lot of red flags. Critics are pointing out that vague terms like promote hatred aren't really defined anywhere, which could risk criminalizing some really passionate but totally lawful debates. And while there's a specific narrow defense for quoting religious texts, there's nothing similar for art or journalism or academic speech. It also flips the burden of proof for displaying hateful symbols, meaning you're basically presumed guilty unless you can prove you had a public interest reason for doing it.
It's not just about what you can say either. The bill also introduces a really powerful new tool to ban entire organizations. These prohibited hate groups don't have to be terrorist groups. They can be outlawed just for spreading hate, which is a much, much lower and less specific bar to clear.
And the consequences here are huge. Simply being a member of a group that the government decides to ban could land you in prison for up to 7 years.
Okay, so we've talked about the software, the ideas, and the speech. Now the bill shifts its focus to the hardware. It aims to restrict the access that extremists have to the physical tools of violence, especially firearms.
The big-ticket item here is a new national gun buyback scheme. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. It really echoes the landmark reforms we saw back in 1996 after the Port Arthur massacre. The idea is for the government to work with the states to buy back certain firearms, all with the goal of reducing the total number of guns out there in the community. But as you'd expect, this is pretty hotly debated.
On one hand, supporters say it's a proven way to improve public safety and get guns off the street. But on the other hand, opponents argue that criminals and extremists aren't exactly going to line up to hand in their weapons. They say it mainly just punishes lawful gun owners and could end up being a really expensive symbolic gesture.
And the buyback isn't the only thing. The bill goes further. It brings in stronger background checks that use national intelligence data, it tightens import controls with a new public safety test, and it creates a brand new federal crime for sharing instructions online about how to make firearms or explosives.
So, after looking at all these pieces, we get to what might be the single biggest overarching criticism of this whole package, that this law was cooked up in a massive rush, but its consequences could stick around for years and years. I mean, just think about this. Experts, community groups, legal scholars, they had almost no time for any real consultation. A key parliamentary committee that was supposed to review this 142-page bill was given just days to do it. That kind of timeline is just not normal, and it's raised serious fears that a flawed law is getting pushed through.
And that's the central fear here, isn't it? Could rushing this legislation actually lead to some major unintended consequences down the road?
Well, critics warn that it could have a chilling effect on legitimate public debate on sensitive topics like religion or immigration. It could accidentally create martyrs for extremist causes who would just claim they're being persecuted for their beliefs. Not only that, but it could also drive these hate groups further underground, making them even harder for intelligence agencies to keep an eye on. And, of course, there's always the risk that a law this broad could be enforced in a selective or political way.
So, if this bill is potentially so flawed, what's the alternative? Critics are arguing that there are much better ways to target genuine hate without putting fundamental civil liberties at risk.
And a lot of the recommendations really boil down to one thing: making the law more precise. For example, what if we narrowed the definition of hate speech so that it required a direct incitement to actual violence? Or what if we introduced broad defenses for good faith journalism, art, and academic speech? Other ideas include adding independent oversight to monitor how the law is being used, and maybe even separating the gun control measures so they can have their own focused, evidence-based debate.
And this really leaves us with the central dilemma, doesn't it? When a horrific tragedy happens, is it better for a government to act decisively with a tool that might be imperfect? Or is it better to risk being seen as doing nothing while you search for the perfect solution? That is the incredibly tough question at the very heart of this entire debate.